In this video we are going to look at converting percents and fractions and also percents and decimals. So what that means is, given any percent, we want to be able to express it as a fraction. Given any fraction, we want to be able to express it as an equivalent percent. If we have a percent, we want to be able to change it to a decimal. If we have a decimal, we want to be able to change it to a percent. So the important thing to realize before we get started is that every number can be expressed as a percent, a fraction, and a decimal. Let's look at the most common fraction, percent, decimal conversion that you probably already know. Alright, so here's a fraction, 1/2. Well, that fraction has a percent equivalent. Hopefully you're thinking of it. What is the equivalent percent of 1/2? 1/2 would be what percent? If something's 1/2 off in the store, it's going to be 50% off. And what is the decimal equivalent of 1/2? 1/2 of a dollar is how much? 0.5, 50 cents. We could put a 0 there if we want, but we don't need that 0. So actually, to show that, why don't I put that 0 in a different color? I mean, when you're thinking about money, or talking about money, then this might help us think about $1/2 dollar is 50 cents. 0.50 would be how you would represent 50 cents, but that's the same as 0.05. So if we look at a picture of this, we look at this circle up here, we cut it into 4 pieces. 50% is going to be 2 of these slices right here. Actually, I want to use this circle to talk about this cake, but here's a half a cake. We'll look at this half right here. So that would be 50% of the cake, or 0.50 of the cake. Now, what does that mean, 0.50? Well, then we have to start talking about place value. So since you're in this percent block, you've probably already done decimals, and so you know about place value. This place value right here where the 5 is, that is your tenths. Tenths. And the 0 is your hundredths. So we could think of this 0.5, if we wanted to convert it to a fraction, it would be 5 is in the tenth spot, that would be 5 tenths. If we looked at it as 0.50, it would be 50, and then that goes to the hundredth spot, so it would be 50 hundredths. And both of those reduce down to 1/2. And that would be converting a decimal to a fraction. Alright, so what does percent mean? Percent means literally per 100. There's a lot of words that have cent in them, like century, bicentennial, centennial. Cent means 100. So percent literally means per 100. So here's our first quick, easy look at how you convert a percent to a fraction. Percent means per 100, so I can simply take that number, that's my percent, and put it over 100. If 50% of the people are voting for Jim, that means 50 out of 100 are voting for Jim. Then you can just take that fraction and reduce it. So we can start to see here how a very familiar amount, 1/2, can be represented in 3 different ways. 1/2, 50%, 0.5. They're all equivalent. That's the important thing to realize, is all these values are equal, and I can use them interchangeably to talk about something without changing the value. And different situations are going to call for different representations of the number. So like I was saying, for example, when we talk about $1/2 dollar, we usually talk about 50 cents, but we could also talk about 50% of a dollar. 50% of a dollar would be 50 cents. Same thing in the store. We usually talk about 50% off, although sometimes you will see half off, but you usually don't see 0.5 off. It wouldn't be wrong, it's just not usually how we use that number, how we represent the number. So what we want to do today is be able to convert from percents to fractions and percents to decimals for values that are maybe not as familiar to us as 1/2. So one thing I want you to notice before I clear out this half is, okay, let's look at this quarter now. So let's take a half and we'll cut it again and we'll get a quarter. So here's a top view of that cake. Okay, so here's the half a cake that we were looking at, and then there's a quarter over here. So here's the half from the picture, and here's the quarter from the picture of the cake that's still there. And then the part that's shaded represents the piece that's gone. And so how much of the cake is gone? Okay, so we could talk about that as a fraction, a percent, or a decimal. And what I want you to notice is if we look at it as a fraction, all these pieces should add up to one cake. A half plus a quarter plus whatever's gone, which hopefully you kind of have an idea about what that fraction is. If not, that's okay. But all those should add up to one cake. If we look at the decimal representation of these pieces, that should also add up to 1. And the percent, if we look at the percent representation of all these pieces, should add up to be 100%. Alright, so we know this half a cake over here is 50%. We've already talked about that. So the other half here, let's look at it from the top view. The other half has been cut into half itself. So this 50%, and you guys probably already know your percent for a quarter, but this is just another way to look at it. If we take 50% and cut that in half, we have 25%. And then we have another 25% here. So all those percentages add up to be 100%. And that's important. That should always happen. If we look at the decimal representation, the decimal for 0.5 or for 50% is 0.5. And what we want for the decimal of the other two parts here is we want those to add up to 1 when we add it to the 0.5. So over here we need 0.25, and again, money really helps to think about this, because if this is like a whole dollar instead of a whole cake, we have 50 cents, and then we're going to split that up into two other pieces. So we would have a quarter and a quarter, which is called a quarter for a reason, because it's 25 cents, 0.25. Notice how 0.5 plus 0.25 plus 0.25 add up to be 1. We could even go over here and do that. 0.5 plus 0.25 plus 0.25. If we add all that up, 5 plus 5 is 10, carry the 1. We got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, carry the 1. Bring your decimal straight down, and we get 1. And we need that decimal to come out to be 1. And we need our percent to come out to be 100. 50 plus 25 plus 25 is 100%. So that's something we want to keep in mind when we're looking at other examples here. All right, let's look at another example. Let's pull in another picture here. How about this one? Okay. So what we want to do is represent these slices as a decimal, a percent, and a fraction. So let's look at this first slice. I think the easiest way to start, well, I don't know, they're probably equally easy. I was going to say the easiest way to start is a fraction, but actually a fraction or a percent probably wouldn't be too hard. Well, let's start with a fraction. So if we colored this in here, what fraction of the whole, whatever this is, pizza, is this one slice? Well, we're cut into 5 pieces, and we've got 1 slice out of 5, so that would be 1/5. Now if we think of it as a percentage, we have 100% of our pizza, and we're splitting it into 5 pieces. So if we take 100% and divide it by 5, 5 goes into 10 twice, and then we have 0. So we have 20%. So each slice is 20%. 20%, 20%, 20%, and that should all add up to be 100%. What that means then is 1/5 is equivalent to 20%. That's the same value. Now how about the decimal? Alright, we want to take a decimal of 1, and we want to divide that into 5 pieces. Remember, we want our decimal to add up to be 1. So if I put a decimal here and a decimal here and a 0 here, 5 goes into 10 2 times. 5 goes into 0, 0. I guess 0.2 was enough, huh? We didn't really need to do any farther. So 0.2. 0.2 plus 0.2 would be 0.4, plus another 0.2 would be 0.6, plus another 0.2 would be 0.8, plus another 0.2 would be 1. So that adds up to be 1, and that's what we want. We want all our fractions to add up to be 1, all our decimals to add up to be 1 and our percents to add up to be 100%. So here we have the fraction, percent, and decimal representation of the same value, which is 1/5 of something. So if you're getting 20% off in a store, you're getting 1/5 off. Those are equivalent values. So I'm looking at some easy examples first so we can see how these all add up. And we're going to look at a more complicated example in a second. Before we look at a more complicated example, hopefully you're starting to see a pattern between the decimal and the percent. There's an easier way to convert decimals to percents than go through this division. And that is to simply move the decimal 2 places. So if I have 20%, I don't have a decimal written here, but if I did, it would be at the end of the number. Whenever there's no decimal written, it's at the far right-hand side. So if I take that decimal and I move it 2 places to the left, 1, 2, and I put the decimal right there, I get my decimal representation, which is 0.2, and that always works. And the reason that it works is because if I have something like 0.2, let's put another 0 there, okay? Because we want to change it to a percent, and percent is out of 100. And remember, this place is hundredths. So this is tenths and this is hundredths. How would I write 0.20? How would I say that so I could write it as a fraction? 0.20 is 20 100ths. And what does percent mean? Percent means per 100. So 20 per 100 is 20%. That's why you just move the decimal 2 places to the right if you want to change a decimal to a percent, or 2 places to the left if you want to change a percent to a decimal, because it has to do with the fact that percent means per 100. So an easy way to remember that is 100 has 2 zeros in it, so you're going to move your decimal 2 places. So with that little trick, we should be able to, it's not really a trick, with that skill, we should be able to convert decimals to percents pretty easily. Let's do some tougher examples that we don't have pictures for. Let's say we have something like 63%. I don't have a circle. Let's cut into 100 pieces with 63 of them shaded. But how could I write that as a decimal? Remember, all you have to do is move the decimal 2 places to the left. 1, 2. So here's your decimal at the end of 63. 2 places. That would go right there. So that would give us 0.63. And you don't have to write your 0 there if you don't want to, but I usually do just to accentuate the fact that there is a decimal here and make that stand out. So it's that easy. That's all you got to do is move the decimal 2 places to the left. All right, let's try a couple more. What if I have a number with a decimal in it, like, well, let's see, I think the tax rate is, I think it's 8.9% right now in Washington. It could be 8.7, something like that, but it's got a decimal in it. So if I wanted to change that percent, now even though this has a decimal in it, it's still a percent value because it has a percentage. I want to change it to a pure decimal by moving the decimal 2 places to the left. So go ahead and think about what that would be. Maybe even jot it down. All right, let's move it 2 places. So we got 1 will take us around the 8, and then we got to go 1 more place and there's nothing there. So we need to put a 0 there to hold that place. Therefore, our answer is going to be 0.089. What if we have something that's bigger than 100%? Say we have something like 130%. Okay, you're still going to move the decimal 2 places. So your decimal's at the end of your 130 still. Move it 2 places, 1, 2, and you end up with 1.30, and you don't really have to write that 0 there. Just be 1.3. All right, let's go the other direction. Let's say we have a decimal, and we want to change that to a percent. Well, all we got to do is move the decimal back the other direction. We're just going to take the decimal and we're going to move it 2 places to the right. So for example, if I have a number like 0.35, what percent would that be? Just move this decimal 2 places to the right and you have 35%. How about 0.03? What would that be? 2 places to the right, 3%. 1, 2. Think about it. This is your hundredth spot. If I were to read this decimal, its value is 3 hundredths because the 3's in the hundredth spot. 3 hundredths. 3% means 3 out of 100. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, let's try another one. Let's try one that's going to end up with maybe a decimal in it, like 1.138. What percent would that be? So if I were to read this decimal, it's actually thousands. It's 138 thousandths. I'm only going to move the decimal 2 places. So I end up with 13.8%. So it's okay to end up with a decimal in your percent value. It just means you have a part of a percent, a part of 1%. It's like between 13 and 14%. It's a little bit more than 13.5%, and that's okay. So to have a percent come out to be bigger than 100%, we'd have to start off with a number bigger than 1. Say we had 1.6, and we wanted to change that to a percent. Do the same thing. We want to move the decimal 2 places to the right. So what do we get? 1, 2. I'm going to have to put a 0 there. We end up with 160%, 160%. So changing a decimal to a percent and a percent to a decimal is a pretty straightforward operation. It's just a matter of moving that decimal around. Alright, so that covers percents to decimals. Let's talk about fractions. Fractions can be a little more complicated. Let's start with a percent to a fraction. That's probably the easiest, and we've already talked about it a little bit. A percent to a fraction. Well, we know what percent means, right? Percent means per 100. So 15% literally means 15 per 100. There you go. Boom. You got your fraction. Pretty easy. Now, we should reduce it. It's always good manners to reduce your fraction. So what goes into both 15 and 100? Let's see. 5. So we could divide the top and bottom by 5. And we end up with 3/20. So 3 out of 20 is equivalent to 15%. If 3 out of 20 people floss every day, that would be the same thing as 15 out of 100 people. It would be proportional. If we took these 3 out of 20 and expanded it, we'd have 6 out of 40. Got another 20 people, we'd have 9 out of 60. We got another 20 people, we'd have 12 out of 80. And if we got another 20 people, we'd have 15 out of 100. Which is 15%. So all of these are 15%. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, let's try another percent. Let's say we have, it's hard to get much trickier. I guess we could do a percent over 100. Say we've got 120%. 120%. This is a little hard to think about with people because it's kind of easier to think about with money. If something is increasing by 120% or something like that, it means you're paying more than what you started with. Actually, if something increased by 120%, you'd be paying double. But if something was 120% of what it was last year, it would be 20% higher than what it was last year. So it's kind of like you have the whole plus more. The percents that are bigger than 100 take a little bit of practice to visualize. But we could still turn it to a fraction, and we would still put it over 100. We would put 120 over 100. And then we would want to reduce it. Now, anytime you have a fraction that has zeros on the ends, you can cancel those zeros. That's what you're really doing there, is dividing by 10. And so then we would have 12 over 10. Can we reduce that? I think so. Divide by 6. Divide by 6. No, not divide by 6. I think I figured out the answer before I wrote down what I was dividing by. Divide by 2, which gives us 6. How about that? Better? Divide by 2. That gives us 6 over 5. Or we could change that to 1 and 1/5. So the 1/5 is your 20%. Remember, 1/5 was 20%, and your 1 is your 100%. So 120% is 1 and 1/5. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Pretty straightforward to change a percent to a fraction. Okay, let's try a fraction to a percent. Let's say I have a fraction. Let's get rid of this. Fraction to a percent. Let's start off with an easy one. Fraction to a percent. I'll give you two strategies for doing this. The first strategy is to put it over, to turn it into hundredths if you can. So, for example, let's say you have something like 7/20ths. If I can change that into a hundredths, I can write it as a percent very easily. And since the bottom number is a number that I can multiply by something to get 100, then I could take and multiply the top by the same number and create an equivalent fraction. 35 over 100 is the same as 7/20ths, and then if I have 35 over 100, I know that's 35%. Done. Now this doesn't work for every kind of fraction because not every denominator is easy to multiply by something to get 100. Let's do one more example of those though. Let's do, how about 11 over 25? Okay, is that one where we could get 100 on the bottom, change it to hundredths? It is. Can you do that real quick? What would you multiply by? Times by 4. So you got times by 4 on the top. You get 44 on the top. So what's your percent? That's right, 44%. There's one way to change a fraction to a percent. If 11 out of 25 people visit their doctor every year, that means 44% of the people are visiting their doctor every year. Let's look at one where you can't change it to a 100. A little bit tougher. Actually, here's a picture of a situation. Let's say we want to figure out what percent of that circle is shaded. Well, it's easy to figure out what fraction of that circle is shaded. We can just count up our slices. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And 5 of those slices are shaded. So we have 5/8. We need to convert that to a percent. Notice 8 times nothing is going to give us 100, at least a nice number. If you could do it with a decimal, if you could figure it out, that would still work. The other way to figure it out is to do the division. Remember, a fraction bar means divide. So we are literally going to divide 5 divided by 8. So remember, as one of my colleagues once showed me, if you want to change this to a divide problem, you think of this little guy on a diving board and he jumps into the water there, and that's how you set up your division problem. The 5 has to go inside. So we'll set up our division problem like this. 5 divided by 8. 5 divided by 8. So I've got to take, well, 8's not going to go into 5, is it? So I'm going to have to put a decimal there, add a 0. 8 into 50. Let's see, 8 times 6 is 48. 2. I got to keep going until I have a remainder of 0. So I'm going to add another 0. 8 goes into 20 twice, which is 16. I got to keep going. All right, add a 0, add a 0. 8, oh good, this is going to end it, I think. There's a 5. 40, that's 0. I'm done. So I have my decimal of 0.625. All right, so now I know that 5/8 is equal to 0.625 equal to 0.625. We have a decimal now, which is easy to convert to a percent. Do you remember how to do it from a couple minutes ago? Move the decimal 2 places. So we have 62.5%. So this green part right here is 62.5%, and that of the entire circle, which kind of makes sense. You can see it's more than 50%, and it's less than 75%. Like, we know that this piece over here would be 25%. This is another way to look at it. So if we take that 25% and cut it in half, what's half of 25? This piece right here would be 12.5%. So each slice is 12.5%. Let's see. So if I did 12.5 times 5, I bet I would get 62.5. So that's another way that you could do it. Let's try one more fraction to a percent why don't you try this one? You might want to pause the video and just try it, and then I'll go through it. Let's try one that we can't change to 100. Alright, this one's not too hard, but that's okay. Let's do 3/10. Alright, change that to a percent. Alright, so we'll go ahead and do the division. So I'm going to set it up like this. I can't take 10 into 3, so I put my decimal there and put a 0. 10 goes into 33 times exactly. So I'm done with my decimal. I have 0.3. To change that to a percent, I'm going to move it 2 places. I'm going to have to put a 0 there. And then I put my percent on, and we have it. 30%. Hopefully you got that. Alright, well I hope that helps converting percents to fractions and fractions to percents, percents to decimals and decimals to percents. That's really the first key, and being able to visualize all this stuff is the first key to being able to solve problems that involve percents.